Time for a new web partner planning for a change. I'm really excited about this topic today. A little different than a lot of the conversations we've been having recently. So here's our game plan. We're going to talk about, of course, finding a new web partner and things like that. But we felt like there's a little bit of information sharing and level setting we wanted to do with the group before we got into that topic, and kind of explore some of the complexity of understanding when you might need different things within your environment in order to be successful. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about how we see the role of digital changing in healthcare. We understand that some of you are living that day to day, but not every organization is kind of in the same place of its thinking and how that factors into their planning. We wanted to share some information from our latest industry trend survey, looking at website redesigns and platform changes and some of that kind of stuff, get some of the data about what's been going on the last couple of years and what we're expecting here in the next couple of years as well. And in looking at that data, what becomes clear is that there are a number of things that become really intertwined and interconnected here when we start talking about things like finding a new partner. These things tend to start with web redesigns and replatforming, picking a different content management system or digital experience platform. Those things often happen together, and often finding a new partner is interconnected with that set of decisions as well. So we'll talk through each of these kind of in turn to understand what are the signs that a redesign is probably in order. What are the signs that maybe the platform that you've got isn't right to support the things that you want to do, and so forth. We'll get into then some ideas about planning for long-term success, both with a new web platform, new web partner, new relationship there. And of course, as always, we'll have time hopefully for some Q&A at the end of the session as well, although I encourage you to go ahead and submit those questions as you're going through the session, just because we tend to forget them sometimes by the time we get to the end of things. So submit those as they come to mind. So let's start off talking just a little bit about the context. This is a really strange time for health systems. Right? Operating margins are really tight. There's a lot of strangeness going on with staffing and capacity and volumes and all sorts of things going on within our space right now. And so as we're talking to organizations, one of the questions that keeps coming up over and over again is when they start talking about the need to make some changes in the way they're presenting themselves digitally, they get these questions about, maybe the organization is not financially where they want to be, or maybe they're losing a lot of money. That's not uncommon for a lot of health systems right now, and asking if this is really the right time to make these kinds of investments. And I think the thing that's clear to us right now is as volumes are rebounding, and they are, I think in the primary care realm, what I'm hearing from organizations is they're at or near pre-pandemic levels for a lot of specialty services and elective procedures. There may be a little further behind. It varies a little bit organization to organization. Some of that is more about staffing than it is about the other kind of macroeconomic trends that are driving business right now. But volumes are rebounding right now. And while many organizations have put many of these initiatives on hold over the last couple of years, there are other organizations that haven't, and those organizations that have been able to leapfrog ahead, that have been really able to advance what they're doing from a digital perspective, anecdotally speaking, of course, but they seem to be able to drive volume more effectively. They seem to be able to rebound more effectively than the organizations that maybe have not been able to make those kinds of investments over the last couple of years. Importantly, they're able to steer and drive some incoming business demand from places that maybe are higher demand for them, maybe help them close the financial gaps a little bit more effectively. So it puts them in the driver's seat to a different degree. So the organizations that haven't been doing that, they're really on the hook right now in order to play catch up, and just so that they can do those same kinds of things as their organization's trying to get back on its footing. During the last couple of years, a lot of things have changed. We're just not in the same place today that we were in early 2020, and that's particularly true when we look at digital realities. I've talked for a long time about how consumer expectations around digital experiences are set by the brands that they're engaging with every day. So they're not set by what you're doing today. That kind of mental bar is not being set by what your competitor across the street is doing. In almost all cases, it's being set by the experiences people are having on Amazon and Netflix and Apple and Google and Zoom and Uber and Starbucks and the grocery store that they're ordering online from and the pizza place they're ordering online from. And in that context, for the most part, healthcare is not just behind, but has been falling farther and farther behind throughout the course of the pandemic. We've been interacting with a lot of brands digitally over the last couple of years. A lot of those are digital native brands that are very, very good at creating those experiences. A lot of those have been strong brick and mortar brands that have really been able to bring resources to bear to create integrated online offline experiences that have worked well for consumers. That's the bar we're reaching for now, and we really need to move forward as an industry in order to catch up with consumer expectations in these spaces. Now, at the same time, we have some challenges that we've never had before. Consumers have more options for accessing care than they ever have in the past, and that's coming from many, many different places as well. Some of that's coming from other traditional healthcare providers that have expanded their footprint or expanded services, but it's also coming from startups, many of whom have new care delivery models. It's coming from established retail players. It's coming from digital brands like Amazon. All those organizations bring different strengths to the mix. And while those strengths look very different than the traditional healthcare players, the reality is that in a very consumer-centered environment, those are almost certainly going to eat away at the margins as we're trying to rebound and bring patients back into the fold and get them receiving care again. I hear from a lot of the organizations we work with that over the course of the pandemic, that marketing and digital communications folks got their sort of proverbial seat at the table in ways that they hadn't in the past within their organizations. Communications, and in particular digital communications, was really, really key for engaging with consumers and the public over the course of this pandemic. And I think it's viewed by senior leadership to have an importance attached to it that's very different than it did just a couple of years ago. Now the pressure's on to innovate. What can we do both with that seat at the table and with the new tools and technologies that have come online and become available to us in the last couple of years in order to really engage with consumers in new ways and to differentiate ourselves competitively. Now, I wanted to include also some insights from our most recent healthcare digital marketing trends survey. And this is a survey that we've done over the years, looking at a wide range of issues, but in particular, I wanted to look at trends around redesigns and replatforming. So we've looked for many, many years at how organizations are thinking about redesigns, if they're in the process of doing a redesign, if they've done one recently. In some years, the cycle for this stuff has been as short as maybe even 3 or 4 years, right? Maybe a third of organizations are in the process of doing a redesign right now, a third have recently completed one, a third are in the planning stages. That'd be kind of a perfect 3-year cycle. It's never quite that clean, but sometimes that cycle is relatively short, like 3 to 4 year cycle. Sometimes it's quite long. It's been as long as maybe a 7-year cycle with 15% or 15% looking at these things. Now, in 2020, the pandemic had a really distortive effect on the kind of cycle times that we've seen in the past. What I mean by that is normally the number of organizations that are planning and doing and maybe have recently completed redesigns tends to be pretty similar. We tend to see them cycle kind of up and down together. In 2020, we saw that really different between those groups. Only 14% had completed or had a redesign in process. 20% had completed a redesign. 30% were in the planning stages. And what that told us was a lot of organizations had put initiatives on hold because of financial uncertainty, because of shutdowns, because of just everything going on with the pandemic. A lot of organizations just said, this isn't something we're going to take on right now. There certainly were organizations moving forward, but there were a lot of organizations that weren't. That didn't mean that the demand to do some of those things wasn't there, just that organizations were not actually getting to projects in nearly the kinds of numbers that they would have without the effect of the pandemic in place. Now, the chart we're looking at here is from our most recent, the 2021 survey. We're seeing some of that still in play here, right? Only 10% had a redesign in process. Only 13% had completed one in the last 12 months. but 24% had one of the redesign stages. Now, this one was a little bit different because we added a new category. And the new category we added was using iterative site improvement rather than redesigns. So we're seeing more organizations who are saying, maybe we're not going to blow our site up and do major overhauls of it quite as often. But the trade-off there is we're going to be much more aggressive in making site changes over time in order to extend the life of a particular redesign. Maybe we'll be able to sort of quote unquote avoid doing the redesign overall, but I think most organizations are just thinking they can get a much longer life and get a lot more value through that process by doing that iterative site improvement process instead. Probably also a little bit because of organizations' reticence to take on big projects. This was a place organizations went to try to continue to move things forward, even when they couldn't get the big dollar budget to make the changes maybe they planned to or wanted to through at that time. Now, we also ask about replatforming, right? Are you going to change content management systems or DXP solutions, digital experience platforms? Now, in general, replatforming happens a lot less frequently than redesigns. The figures we saw in 2021, pretty similar to 2020. And again, similar kind of delay to projects here as well. Many organizations in the planning stages, much smaller numbers that were in progress or had recently completed platform changes in 2021. Now, I really like to look at these things together. So the columns here are that propensity to redesign. The rows are looking at CMS changes. And there's a couple of big takeaways here as we look at this together. The first is that platform changes are pretty rare when there isn't already a redesign in process. It's pretty rare that an organization redesigns and then a year later says, hey, we're going to put a new platform in place, pick up our newly redesigned site and put it on the new platform. There's a lot of repeated work that happens when you do those sorts of things. And honestly, different platforms have different strengths. And often you sort of lose the opportunity to design your platform to really take advantage of the strengths of or redesign the site, take advantage of the strengths of the platform when you don't kind of do those things together. Also, usually a redesign will kind of alleviate enough pain that it's hard to go back and get the budget for that second project. So we tend to see these things happening together. Now, the flip side of that, though, for those that are in the process of redesigning now, and for those that are in the planning stages, we have huge numbers of organizations that are either evaluating a platform change as part of that redesign or committed to making those changes. 57% planning, and more committed to change on top of that. So we are seeing a lot of organizations, since they've waited, putting everything on the table and at least evaluating all these things as part of their process as they're looking at it now. All right, with those things as intertwined as they are, though, it's not surprising that we typically see when an organization decides, hey, we need a different content management system, or we need to step up to a DXP platform, or hey, maybe it's time for us to look to a new digital partner, that those conversations often start by saying, I think we need to redesign our site. And then figuring out sometimes, do I just need to redesign, or are there more significant changes that we need to make, some different kinds of things that we need to select as part of this process, tends to sometimes be a little bit confusing. And so we wanted to walk through, what are the signs of needing a redesign? What are the signs of platform issues? What are the signs of maybe some partnership challenges to try and look at these things in context? So we're going to start by just looking at the need for a redesign. One of the things that we see commonly these days is that there's been a change to your organization's business, or a change to the business strategy, right? Has the vision for the organization changed? Do you have different plans for moving forward to execute on that vision? Are there different business models at play that weren't in place in the past? Is there a lot of merger and acquisition activity that maybe is different than what you've done in the past? And then you start to factor in brand strategies and marketing strategies and all the other things that are changing in a lot of organizations right now. Oftentimes, the way that you have your site put together today just doesn't represent that, doesn't tell the story particularly well. Wanted to walk through a little bit of an example here. So this is Parkview Health System out in Colorado. Now, a couple of years ago, they went through and kind of reestablished what they wanted their strategy to be. And the strategy was about expansion, and expansion through acquiring new patients through expressing their competitive differentiators, really taking a competitive advantage kind of approach to attracting those new consumers. They wanted to create more actionable experiences. And one of the things that they thought was really key to this was creating a more mobile friendly user experience, digitally speaking. Another important facet of the strategy they were putting into place was all about keeping care local, right? Reducing the amount of outmigration, letting people know that there's really high quality care right where they are, that they don't necessarily need to go to a larger market in order to receive care for some of the more significant issues that they might be facing. So they wanted to really be able to demonstrate the experience and the strength of the services that they had in order to make that connection. And then finally, the changes to the system also were reflected in some new branding. And so while they were able to kind of take the simplest elements of the visual brand and put that into the site as it existed before, really these shifts were about telling their story in a different way and presenting them in a different way, and that required a much more holistic overhaul to the site experience that they had out there. And that's kind of a theme that we see quite a lot with health systems these days, right? The digital experience is no longer accurately reflecting the brand identity, the organization's actual physical structure out there. And these are often things where, again, it's not just a color swap and a new logo in the corner, but really you're telling your story in a fundamentally different way. Um, One example, Ozarks Medical Center in 2020 launched what at the time was their biggest expansion ever. They were launching a new women's health facility at the end of the year, and along with that, it felt like the Ozark Medical Center branding wasn't aligning very well with where they'd grown as an enterprise. So they went through a rebranding exercise, changed to Ozarks Healthcare. But again, it's not just about a new name and maybe a refreshed logo, but this was fundamentally shifting the way they were talking about themselves. Instead of being a single hospital-centered healthcare organization, they were a much broader organization. They needed to be able to tell their story in a different way. Another story, this one from California, is the Community Hospital of the Monterey Peninsula. And we've worked with them for a long, long time. And a few years ago, they went through and they did a rebrand, and they took sort of the enterprise, because they had a lot of moving pieces, and they branded that as Montage. Now, community hospital is still kind of their key destination hospital, as still is today, but Montage was the umbrella that represented all of the different facilities and services that they were providing within the organization. So when they did the rebrand, again, we were able to kind of do the visual elements relatively quickly. But at that time, they had 7 different websites. And so we worked with them to merge those 7 websites together into a single digital presence, giving it a system-focused information architecture, but also really going with a robust location strategy that allowed these distinct entities under the brand some dedicated space to tell their story while still being in support of this larger system brand or enterprise brand. The results were really pretty fantastic, more than a 300% increase in traffic to locations, more than a 60% increase in session duration. So really connecting with people and getting people to the information they needed. Now, sometimes we hear from folks that their site is just no longer performing the way they wish it was, right? And very often, the first signs of this that we see are a loss of organic reach, right? That just less people coming from the search engines out there. And we tend to see this kind of negative cycle that starts happening, right? People can't find you. When they get to you, they aren't sticking around. Maybe they come and they look at one page and then they leave. They're not connecting. And as you really dig into the analytics, it appears they're having a harder time finding the things that they're looking for, getting the things done that they came to the site to do. It's a bad cycle. And like many of these things, like when the chain comes off, you can try to just go through and fix it. You can try harder, but it's difficult to get traction when the fundamental pieces aren't working the way that you want them to. Now, there's a lot of causes of lagging findability, right? And we're not going to get into this in a lot of detail. We do entire webinars just on this topic. But I think it's important for us just to keep in mind that over time, the rules and the algorithms around findability, the search engines basically keep changing, they keep evolving. And so if your site isn't changing and evolving on an ongoing basis to keep up, it's no surprise that you might be losing some of that traction from an organic reach perspective. One of my favorite examples here is Schema. We've been talking about Schema for a long, long time. It's only been within the last couple years that Google and the other search engines have really started to use it in a meaningful way. If you're not familiar with it, Schema is like metadata that you put in the site, particularly around structured data, that describes things about that data very directly to the search engines. So things like doctors and locations should have schema attached to them. And so Google doesn't have to guess at what means what thing. So it can say, hey, this is a doctor, and this is their specialty, and this is the location address, and this is the hours of operation. And Google doesn't need to try to tease that out of the site. Google gives you some visibility benefit for doing these things and doing these things well. If you don't have schema on those parts of your site, it's pretty likely that you have some findability issues, and oftentimes you're spending more in PPC and paid reach in order to compensate for some of the organic reach that's not working as well as you'd like it to. Of course, some organizations start thinking about redesigns because they've been leapfrogged, right? They're just looking at their competitors and saying, wow, like our site just isn't standing up to those competitors in the way that we'd like it to. And really here, this is a more complex set of questions than it used to be. There's a lot of moving pieces in modern healthcare websites. It's not just sort of, content and doctors and locations. We're really looking at scheduling. We're looking at content hubs. We're looking at pulling data from a lot of different sources and building experiences out of it out there. And consumers are engaging with your brand through a lot of different areas that don't live within your site proper, right? It can be business listings that it's finding on Google somewhere. It could be social media platforms. There's just a lot of moving pieces. We like to sort of take a step back and look at these things from the perspective of the digital patient journey. And when you start to kind of identify what the key stages of that journey look like, and make sure that you're supporting each one of them with content and functionality out there within the digital world. Much of that's going to happen in your website, but it may be happening in some other places as well. Then you can really start to build experiences that work well for consumers. Likewise, when you start looking at a site that feels like it's having challenges and you look at it in this window, it starts to become really clear where you may have big gaps in some of those capabilities or some of that content that's failing your consumers in some different and important ways. Of course, we often just get the gut feeling, right? It feels like we are ready for something more with our website. It's been a while. It's time for a change. It's time for us to step up in some way. And it's totally okay to be initiating things from that perspective as well. Now, we've been talking about redesign throughout this whole process. And the reality is that redesigns could be a lot of different things. At its simplest, it's kind of the lift and swap. Hey, we're gonna change some colors. We're maybe gonna rearrange the design a little bit. We've got a new logo to put on there, but it's very much a new coat of paint and a little bit of cleanup of the landscaping, right? But the underlying structure of the site hasn't changed. The underlying content of the site often hasn't changed. Sometimes the underlying functionality of the site hasn't changed, but it spruces things up a little bit, and occasionally that works. I think very often today, just with the amount of change going on in organizations and brands and consumers, that often isn't the right choice. And if you're going to go through and do the effort of the redesign, you're kind of selling yourself short if you're not at least going in and spending some real time addressing structure and content and spending time understanding how the digital experiences you're creating are serving or not serving your consumers the way you want them to. The other end of the spectrum is you blow the whole thing up and you start completely from scratch. And that's pretty rare too, to be totally honest. Don't look at anything we have out there. Let's start with a clean sheet of paper and build this from the ground up without any thought of anything that had happened before. Also unlikely. But working with a good partner can help you figure out what the right balancing act is. Where are the things that are going to have the biggest impact for the dollars you're able to invest in a redesign today, and what things maybe you want to queue up for future budget years or future cycles on this thing to continue to move the site forward after you initially go live with a new design. So things tend to start there, but sometimes you get into that and it doesn't feel like a redesign is going to get you the things that you need. And there comes a question, are we on a platform that's really working for us, that's doing the things we need it to do? And there's some red flags here that we tend to identify as well to say, you know what, this is a real sign that maybe you're on the wrong platform, right? One of those is you're just not getting upgrades. This could mean that your platform is near end of life. It could be that it's just not focused on healthcare and the kinds of problems you have. It could be a number of other issues out there. Um, but if it's been a couple of years, when you did a redesign, maybe it's been 3 years and you haven't actually gotten a platform upgrade in those 3 years, nothing's been refreshed, you've got no new capabilities over that course of time, that's probably indicative of a problem. And maybe that means it's not the right platform for you and your organization. We sometimes see that a loss of a critical technical resource, a couple critical technical resources, tends to make organizations really question whether or not they're on the right platform as well. I was talking with an organization a year or so ago, and they were explaining they had this really talented WordPress guru within their IT group. And so they'd gone with WordPress, they'd built the site, and while the site had been performing pretty well, that one key person had up and left the organization. They moved on. That's really common right now, particularly for technical people in organizations that are not fundamentally technical organizations. And so they'd had some other people look at it. No one was really that clear on what this guy had been doing and how he'd approached some things. And so it was time to do something more dramatic. And they thought maybe the platform wasn't the right platform. It was only the right platform because they had a person in house that they felt was going to take care of them, and did for a period of time. Sometimes your strategy's outgrown the platform as well. We see a lot of organizations where the content structure built into the platform just isn't flexible enough to do the things that they need. Maybe it doesn't support some new way that you want to tell your story or engage with consumers. We've had some organizations where they need to call their digital agency partner every time they want to put content on the site, and that just wasn't working for them either. Right? So it could be a lot of different things here, but sometimes that strategy just outgrows the platform. Here's a different example. We've worked with Cape Cod Healthcare for many years, and a couple of years ago, they decided that they really wanted to embrace brand journalism. And I know brand journalism and some of those related concepts have become much more common for healthcare organizations, but at the time when they were taking on, it was a pretty small pool of organizations that were doing it, and the ones that were very large organizations that didn't look and feel a lot like Cape Cod Healthcare. But they took on this initiative, Cape Cod Health News, really built out a newsroom and have done a great job over the years, producing a lot of great content from the perspective of the consumer and using that as a way to really showcase the organization and their providers and the services that they offer. Now, when they originally built this, they put this on a WordPress site and it functioned pretty well. But a couple of years ago, we merged that into the core digital experience for their overall website. By doing that, we were able to create much more robust interconnections between this sort of high consumed content and all of the services and other information that was contained within their website. But also we got this added benefit. This content that's changing and being updated and having new content added all the time was really looked on very positively by the search engine. So the SEO boost not just worked for the Cape Cod Health News, where now it was part of this bigger .org site, but also this really boosted the organic visibility of a lot of core Cape Cod Health content as well. So bringing those things together really helped the visibility and the engagement level for the investment they were making in developing this content. Here again, we see some organizations that also just say, we need more from the platform. We're not getting enough today. And here we have a good example of that. Henry Mayo out in California, Henry Mayo Newhall Hospital, was feeling really constrained by the platform that they have in place. They didn't have a lot of flexibility. There's not a lot of things they could do themselves. Honestly, most of the time, if they had to update content, they needed to call their agency partner, let alone launching microsites and doing a lot of the other things that they wanted to be doing on a regular basis. And so they decided that the platform they were on couldn't carry them forward. We here at Genetric happen to be working with them on their intranet, and they like the flexibility of the platform that we were providing for them there. And so they moved to that same platform for their public web efforts as well. Now, another interesting one that we've been seeing more and more recently is that organizations have invested in what's often a really nice platform. But whatever the thing was that made that platform stand out, the thing that was really the reason why they picked it in the first place, oftentimes they find it very difficult to actually use. It doesn't stand up the way that they thought it was going to. It doesn't maybe work as simply as it was demoed to them. The amount of resources they need just for the ongoing care and feeding of the platform is absorbing all their resources, and they have nothing left to try and do some of the new shiny things that they thought they were going to be able to execute on when they took the platform on in the first place. Sometimes organizations take on platforms that are too big, right? You need to be realistic about what resources your organization is going to put into these things, what your team looks like, its capacity, the skill sets you have there, and look at all those things to find a platform that fits right. Getting more platform isn't always better if you don't have the resources to actually make those things work. A lot of those big platforms are pretty challenging to do things on over time, and they can be great platforms, but you need to have a lot of resources to execute on them properly. So when you are evaluating different platforms, there's a lot of things that come into the mix. You do need to think about organizational goals and the things that you're doing today, some of which you might want to bring along into the new site. You need to think about your overall strategy for what you want to do to engage with consumers digitally. Really importantly, you need to think about the resources that you have to apply to this project in the short term and the long term. You might have a great team, but that team might be too small to really do some of the things that you're going to try and do. Or you might not have the technical expertise to take on certain platforms in-house. You need to really understand if you've got the right match to the kinds of platforms you're looking at. Fit is really often more important than anything else. Increasingly as well, the ability for this site to work with other systems that you have in place is really, really important, integrating with other tools out there. This is sort of, the way that we tend to view the pieces that fit together into that core digital experience for consumers. The overall marketing tech stack is getting bigger and bigger all the time. And we need to be able to play with a lot more of these different components to really make things work well. When you're evaluating what you need from a content management system or digital experience platform, you really need to wrap your arms around what tools you have in place today, if those tools are what you're going to stick with, or if maybe there's options to switch those out for something else, and then look at how those pieces play together, what the whole ecosystem is going to look like. Some of these more sophisticated platforms bring a lot of options to the table: personalization and digital asset management, and consumer data platforms, and marketing automation. And part of the question just becomes, are you actually going to use any of those tools that this platform brings to the table? If you already have marketing automation and CRM from somewhere else, if you already have asset management in a different platform, right? You may not be looking at some of those pieces when you're doing the evaluation for these things. Buying platforms that duplicate that capability is not going to help you move forward as an organization in a lot of cases. So kind of understanding that fit is really important as well. Then, of course, there's a question of whether it's time for a new partner. Now, sometimes if you're changing Your platform, you're changing your partner by default. Like we work on a number of different partners, but some organizations really just focus in on a single platform. And if that platform's not a match, the partner's not a match for you either. Sometimes it can go the other way around as well. Sometimes if you feel like the partner isn't working, that means that you need a different platform as well. Sometimes things go that direction too, but that's not always the case. So again, we look at some of the things that are kind of the red flags and say, maybe this is not the right partner for you over time. The simplest thing is the vendor isn't meeting its commitments, right? If they're making promises and they're not hitting deadlines, they're not delivering on things, that's pretty clearly going to be a challenge that can only be fixed by picking a different vendor. Sometimes again, the software isn't getting upgrades, and I know this was on my software list too. But sometimes you're not getting upgrades because of the software. Sometimes you're not getting upgrades because your implementation partner, your vendor partner has implemented things in a way that you can't update. They've broken your upgrade path, or the pieces they brought to the table don't support the next version of the software in some ways. And that's a real challenge to you continuing to move your digital operations forward. We do see that sometimes vendors just aren't aligned with your business strategy. Maybe they never were aligned. Maybe there's been some change to your strategy or to their business and they just no longer aligned. But this could present itself in a lot of different ways. Not every technical implementer wants to support you over time. Some companies like to do these big projects and they have a defined start and a defined end, and they can put lots of people on them full time. And then when it's done, and then you're on your own. And maybe that's what you're looking for. Maybe that's what you want. But if you want a partner that's prepared to do more things for you, that's going to be a genuine partner and not just a vendor that's going to help support you over time. If you're with one of those vendors that's just kind of a project implementer, that's probably not the right fit for you. Really evaluate what the things you need out of that relationship look like over time, over the life cycle of the site. And this can, again, pop up in all kinds of different ways. As I mentioned, we've got lots of things in the digital ecosystem for a lot of our clients out there. They have many, many moving pieces, and each one is a little bit different than the next. So sometimes when you need those pieces to play together well, it's difficult to figure out who's going to help you dive into each and every one of these platforms and solve these kinds of problems. We see this a lot right now with marketing attribution, right? We're doing more and more marketing than ever before. We want to know what things are working, but oftentimes there's a lot of handoffs. There's a lot of platforms involved in a consumer's experience by the time there's some conversion that we ultimately want to track. So maybe we have an ad campaign and they come to the website and then they go off to maybe a third-party provider directory that then goes into Epic scheduling software. Making sure that the attribution stuff is carried through all those steps is really complicated. And if you don't have a vendor partner that's going to be committed to helping you solve that problem, that's going to be someone within your environment that's going to have to own sorting out how all these pieces are going to fit together. And that may or may not be something that you are prepared to take on as an organization. Likewise, it's really important that your vendor is committed to healthcare. And I know it's been in fashion in the last few years to look outside healthcare for senior marketing leadership, for instance, or senior operational leadership in some cases, to look outside of healthcare for, for digital expertise and things like that. But the reality is that many of those people that were at all the conferences talking about what they could bring to healthcare have since moved on from healthcare. It's a different beast, it's a different organization. Understanding what's going on here, tracking what's happening with other entities in the space, understanding the cast of characters and the integrations that need to happen and things like that is important. Like we work with Echo, we work with Epic, we work with Cerner, we work with a lot of these platforms that really only exist in healthcare. And I'm sure that other vendors can get in and work with them, but for them to go in, build the relationships, figure out how to work with these systems, it's just going to cost you more money and it's going to take more time to get done than working with someone who's doing those things all the time. A great example of this is the Facebook Metapixel debacle last week. So there was a report that came out. It was picked up by Becker's and a number of other healthcare sources about how sometimes if you've got things set up incorrectly, the sensitive data, potentially sensitive data, could be getting passed to Facebook. It's a complex issue. It's got a lot of moving pieces. And if you're doing things with Facebook, you probably have some of the tracking items on your site where your vendor should have come to you and started a conversation about whether or not you might be doing things that need to change in terms of the way that you're working with Facebook. Now, if you're working with an organization that's working with Facebook all the time, that probably happened. If you're working with an organization where you're the only healthcare client they have or one of only a couple, this probably isn't on their radar at all. And it's up to you to find every time one of these things happens and to figure out what it means for your organization and your site. So um, these are the sorts of things where working with organizations who have a commitment to healthcare really help to move you forward in a different kind of way. All right. So with all of those things about replatforming and redesigning and vendor selection, we wanted to share a couple things that we've found are really important for long-term success of these engagements and these relationships. The first one is to get started early. All these things are going to take more time than you think. The RFP process probably is going to take more time than you think, and it's you need to give everyone time to do their thing, but you need time to evaluate these things to work through the process. The actual project, you can do it in shorter amounts of time than you might like to, but that's the place where things hit the drawing room floor more often, that things get delayed, that more things get pushed into future phases and things like that. And it often puts the most pressure on your team, particularly if your team is owning things like content. Give yourself a lot of time to work through content, or leverage your partners to help make sure that that's going to get done. Really think through what a great partnership relationship looks like to you. Every organization has different team, has different strengths and weaknesses, has different desires in terms of the day-to-day and ongoing support needs that they're going to have. And then engage the potential partners you're looking at to talk to you about the different ways they can work together to support your team based on what you need today, what you think you're going to need in the future, and maybe some scenarios for if the future looks very different than what you anticipate. We tend to have a pretty robust team structure working with our clients. Certainly during any major engagement, we have an account strategist who's working with them over time, helping with the vision for digital communications, helping to make sure that we're in sync with where you're going as an organization and a team. We then also have a project manager who's keeping everyone on task, making sure things are on time, making sure that all the dependencies are top of mind and the people understand what needs to happen in order for the next phase to begin. Then we have a really extensive team behind that that helps support the work. Some of those are really specialized folks in writing or content strategy or digital marketing or different elements of technology. Some of them are really around helping to make sure that you have the tools and the bandwidth there to execute on what you need to do. We also find that it's critically important these days to maintain a relentless focus on the consumer. Healthcare has had a bad habit over the years of kind of defaulting to the biggest title in the room. The CEO wants something for the site and they go with it. Not that you can't sometimes indulge senior leadership, but you need to make sure that the experiences you're creating are for the audiences you're creating them for. And in most cases, that's first and foremost the health consumer. We are bringing a lot of user-centered design concepts into the work that we're doing, particularly when we're doing big replatforming and redesigning initiatives. We're really looking to solve the needs of consumers through the lens of the consumer. Right? We need to put themselves where they're sitting in order to make sure that the things that we're doing are really going to work for them. We've embedded a lot of evidence-based thinking and research into the work that we're doing, and making sure that we've got the elements there to really be able to execute on these things successfully. I always encourage organizations as well to think in phases. Think in phases at several levels. Certainly when we're taking on a big project like a replatforming and redesign initiative, there's phases throughout that project. Everyone's going to have a process, hopefully. We have a process that we've really vetted out through hundreds of site designs and implementations over time. We feel really good about the way that we're able to execute on this and the results that we get from it. But also think about what things are happening within this phase of things and what things happen afterwards. Is that multiple phases of the project? In some cases, it's also just how am I going to be supported after we flip the switch and this thing goes live? So we've given a lot of thought to the support that we give and the cadence of that support. So we have progress calls on a regular basis. Most of the time that's weekly. Some clients have it on a little different cadence. But this is where we're digging into the work that's going on. We're connecting subject matter experts into the conversation. We're coordinating new initiatives that are underway, getting new requests and kind of working through those things. And that's happening on a weekly basis. On a quarterly basis, we're sitting down with the numbers. We're reviewing the analytics, we're reviewing the performance of the site, and particularly any new initiatives, any new things we've put out there. We're talking about new strategies. We're lining up what's going to happen over the next couple of quarters, and seeing how that plan may be shifting and changing based on things that we're learning. And then on an annual basis, we're sitting down with your team and doing some bigger planning. We're aligning around your strategy as an organization, and we're helping to make sure that we've got the right initiatives lined up to support where your organization's trying to go. We also recognize that for most organizations, support needs change over time. And I think the last 2 years has been a great example. We've had many, many clients who have lost staff, and some of that has been, furloughs that have happened, or mandatory cutbacks in time or things like that. Well, the work didn't go away. In fact, in many cases, the work for the digital teams and the communication teams was more than ever. But sometimes they had to take off one day a week in order to save from a budget perspective or other things. And what happened is we needed a team from Geometric who could step in and help to support them in ways that maybe they'd never envisioned needing that support over time. So we've really tried to construct, and as we approach this, we have a broad-based set of different agency expertise, digital agency expertise that we can bring to bear as an extension of your team. And we're working with you very closely. Again, we're meeting, weekly. We have a lot of projects often going on. But the advantage of working with a partner to do some of those things rather than doing those things internally is as different needs happen over time, the structure of that team and the resources that are available there can flex to meet the needs of those new projects. Right now, you might have a real need to optimize SEO. Next, it might be a whole bunch of content development expertise that you need. Next month, it might be that you have some digital marketing expertise, more needs in the digital marketing expertise space. And we can flex and adapt to bring that to you as you need it over time as an extension of your team. So I hope I've given you a lot to think about. I hope that it's answered some of your questions here. We will have time for questions here, so go ahead and enter those in the Q&A field if you haven't already. But we also wanted to make you aware we have sort of a companion white paper for today's session. And the white paper is called "Is it Time for a Redesign?" Again, you'll get a question about that in the post-webinar survey, or you can go out to geometric.com/redesign. You'll be able to request a copy of that document there as well. All right, so I don't actually see any questions. Usually I have one in my pocket. I didn't do that today. If anyone has any questions after this, we'll follow up with you one-on-one. We're happy to do that. And there we go. Next month, we have a new webinar. We have webinar series most months. Next month, we're going to be talking about avoiding the data drop-off. So that example that I talked about with carrying things through all the different platforms that might be touching them as we have this much more complex digital ecosystem out there, we're going to be digging into that in much greater detail next month, talking about exactly that set of issues. So hopefully you'll be able to join us next month to talk about how you can connect data between systems and the implications for measurement and data dashboards and some of those kinds of things. It's a really great session, and I think you'll enjoy it. So hopefully we'll see you again next month. And until then, have a great summer.